Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, listening and watching. My name is Herb. I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Zoom call. Its purpose is to apply the 12 steps to our personal life, the 12 steps out of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, to have a spiritual awakening. I encourage and invite each of us to have an open mind and an open heart, a commitment expressed in the prayer of set aside. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. In the big book on page 25, Bill talks about rocketed into a fourth dimension. He's a poet, but he's also a mystic. I may have mentioned it in an earlier opening comment, maybe toward the beginning of the workshop. The orbit that we're being launched into is the world of the spirit. That's the whole purpose of this process. That's the whole purpose of the 12 steps. It's actually not to deal directly with your addiction. It's to deal directly with your unmanageability by having a relationship with power through a spiritual awakening, and it's the power that then deals with your addiction. It's counterintuitive. But it is the essence of step one, powerlessness. I don't have sufficient power to deal with my addiction. And I can't face it head on. I need to find a power and have a relationship with power that will then empower me and free me. Hear the vocabulary. It doesn't give me strength to deal with my addiction. It deals with my addiction. And I receive the gift of freedom. I actually don't know how that works. I observe that it does. There's a process that we go through by the numbers. Slow, gradual, incremental. And we can't predict when the gift will be received. I received the gift prior to my ever being aware that I had a problem. I had done nothing except be willing to support my wife's recovery. The big book suggests that some of us won't receive the gift until actually we've completed the step 9 process. It's the only time and the first time that the big book promises freedom from addiction. Pages 84 and 85 in step 10, assuming that we've done the majority of step 9 or maybe even completed our step 9 And we've entered fully submerged, immersed in step 10, 11, and 12. And it says we are placed in a position of neutrality. Hear that. We are placed in a position of neutrality. It's not that we achieve anything. We receive this gift. It generates gratitude, certainly, and humility, certainly. I can't do it, humility. I've received the gift, gratitude. I can't explain it, but I can observe it. And it's 100% true. No exceptions in my not so limited experience anymore. I've been at this step work formally in the big book with guidance of somebody who knew what they were doing since 1988. I've been sober since 1984. Rocketed into the fourth dimension. The first stage of the rocket launch is to have an experience of that powerlessness and then to make a decision about that power and that we can have a relationship with it. And the second stage is to look deeply at the impediments to power that are in us. In our effort at understanding and experiencing unmanageability, the second half of the first step, we identified that in the big book as the spiritual malady, a behavioral description on page 52, those bedevilments. That's what it looks like. Unmanageability. That's what it looks like, those bedevilments. And then on page 62, that's what its exact nature is according to the big book. It's a wonderful explanation. Selfishness dash self-centeredness, exclamation point. The next sentence says, that's the root of the trouble. It's not a negative comment. It's an observation of the reality. It's an objective observation of the source of our suffering. Our very human nature. A survival mechanism that manifests in flight, fight, and freeze. And we've looked at how that manifests from its biological, physiological roots in our body, in our emotions, in our mind, in our behavior, in our reactions to threat, fight, flight, freeze, anger, fear, dishonesty, resentment, deep fear and anxiety, secrets, and inappropriate, dishonest sexual behavior. That's the fourth step. To take a look at our behavior, the fruits of the root. To analyze our thoughts, our beliefs, our motives, through looking at our behavior and reflecting using the column 3, column 4 worksheets in the resentment, our emotional reaction of anger, a survival mechanism of fight, looking deeply at our fears, unpacking them to try to come to the exact nature of it. And if in fact we want to do a little extra work to create a vision of what it might look like if we didn't have the fear, the worksheet in the Way of Life document takes us through looking at what would be the opposite, both the virtue and the behavior, so that we can in fact have a vision of, anticipate and expect if we behave a certain way, we will begin to develop the virtue that is the antidote to the fear. Well, the third part in the big book is to take a look at sex. On the surface of it, of course, Bill says that's a really prominent difficulty for the human person and the human race, a source of all kinds of problem. But it's also, from my standpoint, a manifestation of a deeper reality. At the biological, physiological level, I use the term freeze, camouflage, hiding, as a survival mechanism. If I can't fight it and I can't run from it, I hunker down, I hide, I pretend, I cloak myself in a way that camouflages me. And I saw that was the predominant mechanism underneath my sexual behavior. Hiding my motives, even from myself. And of course, then keeping secrets. Not just about our sexual behavior, but about every aspect of our lives, how we perceive, how we think, how we feel, and especially how we behave. And you've heard it in the rooms, I'm sure, we're as sick as our secrets. So we're going to look today at the final instructions in the big book, pages 68, 69, and 70, on our sex inventory. In the Way of Life document, there is a worksheet, but it's not fancy. It's just taking the 9 questions from page 69. Although the sentences are complicated, meaning they use 2, 3, 4 words in them, I break it out into separate sentences so that there are 9 questions in the sex inventory. It was suggested to me that at the top of the worksheet that I just try to remember, how did it start? How did it end? What's its current status? Just to kind of put myself back into the history of it so that I could answer the questions from a current feeling about it or a memory of the past in terms of my motives and the impact on other people. You'll notice that none of the 9 questions are literally about sex itself. Not about gender, not about frequency, not about any of the behavior. Because the sex inventory is not about any of that. It's really about our motives, our beliefs, and the impact of our behavior on others, just like in the resentment, just like in the fear. So that we understand the exact nature and then prepare to both change our behavior so that we don't create that problem in our lives anymore or other people's, and also repair the damage. 6 and 7 to revise and change our behavior. Steps 8 and 9 to repair and address the damage done to other people. When I did the step work in 1988, column 4 was the source of my first spiritual awakening. I didn't get much from the fear inventory other than to identify that I had some, in basically a prayer practice to mitigate and remove them. But the sex inventory was transformative. For the very first time, I reviewed my history and the harms that I had done and the callousness with which I had behaved and the motives that I had. And for the very first time, I answered question number 9. From my standpoint, it's the most important question. It's the heart of and the reason for the sex inventory. What should I have done instead? What should I have done instead? There's no judgment here. There's just an observation and a challenge and some questions. What are my thoughts? What are my beliefs? What are my motives? And how does my behavior impact myself and impact other people? What should I have done instead? I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to take a look specifically at the general features of the sex inventory, because it's brilliant, again, in the sense of Bill takes this wonderful, neutral, almost scientific approach. He said we need to be sensible, page 68. Common sense will be the rule here. Balance will be the guideline here. He says on page 68 that there are extremes. He had just come out of an era of the Victorian and experienced also the libertine era of the flappers and the roaring 20s and prohibition and the jazz culture. So he had seen the Victorian prohibitions, and he had lived through the opposite, in which there was total chaos based on the libertine attitude. The voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think that most of the troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. Freud had just come out with his theories about human behavior and sex as being the underlying cause for all of its deviancy. Page 69. They see its significance everywhere. One school would allow us no flavor, the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. Now here's the brilliance of Alcoholics Anonymous, of the 12-step culture, of the philosophy. We want to stay out of the controversy. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. Again, we have no rules. We have no rules. We have no opinion. Heterosexual, homosexual, celibate, monogamous, polygamous. We have no opinion. But you do. You have an opinion. You have a belief. You have a moral principle inside of you, even though you might not know it. And if you do know it, you don't operate according to it. And this is about becoming conscious. This is about waking up to the principle in us that is there. Some people call it conscience. And certainly it's formed by our family of origin, our religious exposure, if we've had one, society and our culture in general. Absolutely, all of that is formative. But there's an intuition inside of us about right and wrong, about healthy and unhealthy. That's where question number 9 comes in. What should I have done instead? We know intuitively. I should be honest. We know intuitively. I should be aware of them as a person, sensitive to their needs, and not just totally oblivious of anything other than my own satisfaction. Part of my operating principle, I became quite conscious of as a single man. It was inappropriate of me to date married women. And I had never surfaced that consciousness. Then I got married. And as a married man, it was inappropriate of me to have any type of sexual behavior with anybody else. That was part of my commitment to my wife and to myself, not consciously. But it even came down to flirting. It's inappropriate sexual behavior on my part. It's getting vicarious pleasure out of a distraction. I'm just saying, this is my thought. These are my principles. This is my reflection in answer to question number 9. And Bill says, we reviewed our own conduct, and he gives us the 9 questions. Well, at least I make them into 9 questions. And he says we put it all on paper and look at it. And here's the point. In this paragraph on page 69, we tried to shape a sane, healthy, and sound ideal for our future sex life. We look at the present and the past, not to beat ourselves up, not to have a negative list of judgment. No. To observe, to understand, and to say, is this healthy? Is this something I want to continue, or do I want to change it? We subjected each relation to this test. Was it selfish or not? Meaning solely with me in mind, inconsiderate of others' lives and feelings and needs and wants and persons. Well, we can't do this by ourselves, he says again, like he did in resentment and fear. He says, we ask God, that's a prayer, to mold our ideals. In other words, to know what to do, what are the principles, and then to help us to live up to them. You see, Bill acknowledges as human beings we're built in a specific way. We have an ability to know, but we also have ability to decide our will, to take voluntary, completely voluntary action. And the two are separate. Listen to step 11. Praying for knowledge of God's will and the power to do it. We remember that our sex powers are God-given, good. Whatever our ideal turns out to be, notice, correlated to the principle expressed above, we are not the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct down here. Whatever our principle turns out to be, each of us has our principles. And we need to look at it and ask, is this in fact how I want to live my life? You can do anything that you want. You've heard it in meetings, I'm sure. You can do anything that you want, as long as you're willing to endure the consequences of that behavior. We must be willing to make amends where we have done harm, so he's setting us up for the 8th step, as does the worksheet in answering the questions, setting us up for a future review in step 8. We'll come back to that as we do in the resentment inventory, in the fear inventory, again in the sex inventory. It's setting us up for future work. Character defects in step 6, and harms done to other people in step 8. So we don't throw away or burn our 4th step after we finish our 5th step, please. You keep all that material until after you finish your 9th step. This is my recommendation. Because that 4th and 5th step material is the material that will be used to make the list of step 6 and make the list of step 8 and guide us through the healing of step 7 and the forgiveness of step 9. We must be willing to make amends where we have done harm, provided that we do not bring about still more harm by doing that. Of course, that's step 9, isn't it? Make amends unless it's going to create harm. And that's where experience of a sponsor, step guide, spiritual director, therapist are really important, sometimes even an attorney. More about that in step 8 and 9. In meditation, we ask God, in meditation, thinking, we ask God, praying, what we should do about each specific matter. The right answer will come if we want it. So up till now, he's had one operating principle. We have no opinion, but you do. And it's about common sense, balance. But now he's going to express the second operating principle here in the sex inventory. God alone can judge our sex situation. Between you and God, not your sponsor, not your therapist, not your attorney, not your spouse, not your partner. It's between you and God. But Bill's very realistic. Counsel with persons is often desirable. You can talk to all of those people as sounding boards for objectivity, so that you can, in fact, form an intelligent conclusion. In some very major sense, through all of this process, we're reparenting ourselves. We have been given misinformation by our family of origin, by our schools, by our teachers, by society, by our culture. We've been given misinformation. It doesn't serve us well, and we need to challenge it all to come up what we intuitively now, being guided in prayer, being guided through these questions, being guided by objectivity, can form our beliefs about reality. And then he says, we let God be the final judge. So he brings out the big hammer here. It is such an important issue. Suppose we fall short of our ideal, the principle that we've talked about. Let's say we adopt really seriously the principle of fidelity by our standards, by our individual standards. And we become unfaithful for some reason. It doesn't matter the reason. He says, does this mean we're going to get drunk? We're going to have a relapse? Some people tell us so, but this is only half truth. It depends on us and our motives. What's driving us? If we are sorry for what we have done and have the honest desire to let God take us to better things, admitting in all humility that I'm powerless over it, but responsible for it. It's not a cop-out here. We believe we will be forgiven and will have learned our lesson. If we are not sorry, and here's the hammer, and our conduct continues to harm others, there's the key, harming others. This creates the impediment, the obstacle, the cloud in us to the sunlight of the Spirit. We are sure to drink. We are sure to relapse. We are not theorizing. These are facts out of our experience. To sum up about sex, we earnestly pray for the right ideal for guidance, for sanity, balance, healthy thinking, for the power, the strength to do the right thing. And then if all else fails, prayer is good, but action is imperative. We throw ourselves the harder into helping others because this urge comes from our selfishness and self-centeredness in a very simple, direct way. Oh, there's many complications and many explanations. But underneath, selfishness, self-centeredness, exclamation point, this is the root. This takes us out of ourselves. It quiets the imperious urge when to yield would mean heartache. I was able to, as a result of the answer to question number 9, and the motivations represented in this book and by the man who took me through the steps, to come up with a sex ideal. I'm a heterosexual man in a committed relationship of marriage. The agreement is fidelity. My responsibility is to provide an environment of physical and psychological, emotional, and spiritual safety and environment of fostering her personal growth. As the result of finishing the steps in 1988, I was able to incorporate and live by those principles for the rest of our marriage and the rest of my life. Something I had never been able to accomplish before that. In fact, I didn't even know it was necessary or even desirable. Amazing process. I encourage you now to begin to take a look at, if you haven't, assignment 16, to do your own sex inventory. If you've done a sex inventory before and you feel that it's complete up till the last time you completed it, it might have been a year ago or 5 or 10, then go back to the time you finished it and review your experiences from then till now to see if these 9 questions will reveal anything of value to you. If in fact you've done an inventory before on the sex and it doesn't match up to the instructions that I've just articulated, you might want to go back to your earliest memories and apply some of the major events, relationships, activities to those 9 questions so that you re-challenge yourself coming up with your sex ideal, the principles that will guide you in your current and future sex life. We learn from it. It's not about a trip down guilt and shame or judgment. It's about looking at reality, evaluating it, and asking ourselves, how do I want to live today? How do I want to live tomorrow to react? And then take a look at assignment 17. The big book has a few comments on pages 70 and 71 to kind of wrap up the step 4 inventory, but I found it superficial by the standards of my experience then over about a 10-year period of doing these steps about 3 different times. And so I have a list of reflections. They're not necessarily from the big book or even the 12 and 12, but the reflections coming from that as well as my own experience in terms of asking ourselves about guilt and shame, embarrassment, dishonesty, irresponsibility, using the 10-step word disturbance, and then taking a look at what is in actually step 4 in the 12 and 12 chapter on the 7 capital sins. I list them. I've not done much work with them. Some people find them very helpful, and so that's why I include it here. And especially looking at, and I stress here, the secrets. Going into the 4th step, this was the emphasis of the man who took me through the steps, about secrets. And the reason is that the misbehavior that is outlined in resentment and fear and sex and dishonesty creates tension. That's why we address it and learn to live the opposite of what creates that tension. Well, secrets are a major culprit in generating tension in our life, in our consciousness, but especially in our unconscious, in our subconscious. So it's about revealing any tension in us coming from any embarrassment or any dishonesty or any behavior that is a secret that hasn't been talked about. Or if it's still, you feel like it's still a secret, even though it's been talked about, it needs to be captured here, I believe, and then talked about in the 5th step. We'll unpack more of that next week as we take a look at rounding out the step 4 inventory. So review assignment 17 and have as your goal completing your step 4 inventory. Not by next week, maybe not by next month, but take a look at your inventory, take a look at the assignments and the instructions, and take a look at your calendar. Be realistic. Don't over commit, but be realistic. Don't under commit. Is your goal to finish your 4th step? What does that mean? How much work do you plan on doing in the resentment inventory? Are you going to do 5 column 3 and 4s, or 10, or 15? I have suggested no more than 20, but that's only a suggestion. You work with your sponsor, your step guide, your step buddy, as to what's enough. I do that for the workshop that we have here, setting parameters that I think are realistic and that will give you the experience. When I did the work, I wasn't given those parameters. And I found that there was a lot of redundancy. Now, was the redundancy helpful? Mostly yes, because it helped reinforce the dysfunction and the unhealthy thoughts and feelings and behavior. But was it proportionately helpful? I don't think so. Meaning, you are the arbiter as to what's enough. Maybe not on your own. I really recommend an objective sounding board like a sponsor or step guide. Fears, I've suggested 5, 10, or 20. A minimum of 5, a maximum of 20. Totally arbitrary numbers. I've made them up based on my workshop experience with you all. And with the sex inventory, the same. Some people don't have more than one experience. You deal with that and take a look at it over the last, let's say, 20 years in 5-year segments. What should I have done instead? To get a reality check on what is healthy behavior by your standards, both in the past and going forward. So let's bring it to conclusion with the Serenity Prayer. The prayer to really understand reality as it is and grow in wisdom. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.